Okay, so it's 10 a.m. We're here anyway. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, Welcome everybody to our fifth AMA. My name is Neha Kumar and I'm VP at Large. And Loren and Mark, if you could first introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Loren Terveen. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota in the United States. And on the SIGCHI Executive Committee, I am past president. And in that role, I've been asked to help organize the process by which we'll come up with a set of candidates for the upcoming SIGCHI Executive Committee election. So I lead a committee that's simply going to identify a set of people who will run in the election. And of course, then who gets selected is up to the SIGCHI members who vote. So that's my role here.
Okay, I'm Mark Parry. I'm a professor at Brunel University in the UK, where I teach a variety of HCI-related courses. My role in the executive committee is as adjunct chair for volunteer development. And that involves thinking about how we can improve the ways that volunteers engage with SIGCHI and the activities that SIGCHI works with. So we're trying to understand the issues, problems, concerns, and things that happen to volunteers so that we really understand our volunteer base as effectively as we can. And then the second part of that, very much following a usability engineering approach, is to think about how we can extend that understanding of our volunteers to support that with tools and means of better engaging with our volunteer community. So I lead a small team of people doing some data collection with volunteers and volunteer, I guess best term to use that is volunteer managers, people who work with volunteers, who are themselves volunteers, of course. And there's a second part of our team, which is thinking about how we can develop resources to engage with our volunteers to pull on, and a good part of this is to pull on more inclusion and better diversity within that volunteer pool.
Thank you, Mark. And Cliff, would you like to introduce yourself?
No need to. I'm just peeping in on the AMA, hoping to troll it later. My name is Cliff Lampe. I'm the Executive Vice President for SIGCHI and General Chair for CHI 2022. I'm a University of Michigan in the United States.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pull the first few questions from the Slido, and then if anyone on the call would like to ask questions, then we can take those. So the first question that was upvoted 3 times was, how are EC members selected? If there aren't many responses to the call, then how is someone picked? Is the current EC's personal bias, does the current EC's personal bias play a role here?
Okay, thank you for that question. Let's see, I want to answer, I guess that was sort of 3 related questions. So first, how are executive committee members selected? Well, ultimately, they are selected through a vote of the membership in SIGCHI. And we, every 3 years when there's an election, a committee puts together a set of candidates who then are voted on by the membership. And I have posted on the SIGCHI blog a post that sort of details the process by which we are going to come up with a set of candidates. Basically, we are taking open calls. We posted an open call for candidates, for nominations for candidates. People can nominate themselves or people can nominate other people. And basically, we're looking at a number of factors in who we will want to recommend for candidates. Again, this is sort of detailed in the blog, and there's really no surprises here. we're looking for people who have some familiarity with SIGCHI, what the organization SIGCHI does, what its role is in the field. We're hoping to get people who have some relevant experience, particularly working on committees in volunteer organizations. And then also we're looking for people who have some vision of what it is they want to accomplish by being on the SIGCHI Executive Committee. So we're accepting nominations. We also, the committee that's in charge of putting together the slate of candidates has the ability to approach people and ask them to consider running themselves. So the committee can do that as well. So that's how we're coming up with the slate of candidates. I should also say that while we will put together a slate of candidates through this open call process, the members can actually petition to have someone added as a candidate as well. I believe you have to have 1% of the membership of SIGCHI supporting a petition, and then that person gets added as well. So that's how people get selected to become a candidate, and then there is an election. And then I guess the last of the questions was, do the current EC members' personal bias play a role? And of course, I guess I would say we always try to avoid our acting on our personal biases. And we've put together quite a diverse committee, the nominating committee, geographically diverse in terms of gender identity, somewhat racially diverse. And we are trying very hard to have a diverse set of candidates. So yeah, that's our goal in this process.
Would anyone else like to add to that, or any follow-up questions? Yes, Mark.
I can add to that. We do have a clear open calls process, and I'm just putting a link up to that now. And this isn't specifically for the EC, but all of the larger set of roles that are associated with the EC, and broadly hope to roll this out across SIGCHI activities. This should be a process that is transparent and accountable. So we want to make the process as clear as possible. Obviously, we want to pull in as many people with the skills that they can bring to it. And we don't want to be pulling from a small number of people that we already know. We know those are not necessarily going to be the best people for the roles. So we would hope to have as a larger slate as possible, where we pull on a broad set of people and a broad set of skills. So the processes are, I hope, in place to enable that. Of course, we need people to step up to those roles, which is one of the largest problems that we face in these things. These are time-consuming roles, and not everybody who would be appropriate for those roles wants to step up to them. And when we do approach people to ask them to volunteer, they may not wish to take those up. But I hope the process is clear. It's not something that's invisible. We have made this visible to the community.
Anything that anyone would like to follow up on? And I have a follow-up question. So Cliff, you put out an open call recently for CHI 2022. How successful do you think that process was?
Crazy successful. We got over 200 people who volunteered to play some role in CHI. People volunteered for anywhere from 2 to 14 different roles, and wrote up some really nice letters about why they wanted to volunteer. It's been an embarrassment of riches, really, from the people we've had to select. And particularly happily for me, it's people from all over the globe. It's people from academia and industry. It's private consultants, as well as established researchers. It's people who haven't had a chance to volunteer for CHI before, haven't been asked to. So I've been involved in a lot of open calls. They can be hit or miss sometimes in various ways. This one worked surprisingly well for no reason I can pinpoint why it worked well. Maybe it's just because it's related to the conference instead of kind of these more amorphous, vague service roles. People kind of get a sense of what CHI is. but I've been incredibly happy with the turnout from that.
And can you say a word also about the open calls that we had for the AC positions? I know that they haven't been announced yet, but just in terms of the process itself.
Yeah, so we decided in response to a whole bunch of things kind of going on in the community that we were adding a few AC positions, for instance, ACs for equity, ACs for accessibility, and ACs for communication. And the role for that is we sent out, again, open calls across all the interesting channels that we have. I think one of the things people have a hard time understanding about SIGCHI that took me a while to really grok is we don't have one way to get a hold of everybody, right? Like there's no one canonical list. It's the thing that I think challenges us most in our day-to-day lives as EC members is like we have the mailing list, but that gets out of date quickly because it's dependent on membership and not everybody remembers to update their membership. We have our social media channels, but of course, some people aren't on Twitter and some people aren't on Facebook. And I've been posting my TikTok videos on EC business regularly and nobody seems to watch them. So like, you know, that's a challenge. So we send it out there. We just broadcast it as far as we can. We got a lot of great candidates who came in for those positions. And then the process is that EC reviews them. We do like almost like an academia cluster review where everybody independently reviews candidates and we take aggregate scores. And then we run group interviews with a smaller pool of candidates. And then from there, the EC deliberates and discusses the candidates that we feel the president should invite to be ACs.
Cliff, I wonder if you could talk a little bit or maybe explain what do you mean by an AC? Sorry,
it's an associate chair. If you look at the bylaws of SIGCHI, which is super good reading, right? Like that's what I read before I go to bed every night. The ACs are basically ad hoc positions that the president of SIGCHI can appoint to serve a specific need that SIGCHI is facing right now. So some members of the executive committee are regular and voted on as defined by our bylaws. So for instance, our person who handles finances and budget is a position that you vote on and is voted into position. There are certain roles that the president chooses, that they're in the bylaws and they appear all the time at every version of the EC, but the president basically chooses that person. So that would include like publications and operations and things like that. And then there's some positions that are ad hoc, and those are the associate chairs, and they come in basically to, like, for instance, right now, because of everything going on with Black Lives Matters, because we know that there's a huge challenge with global equity that's taking place right now, we're trying to add more expertise and more help around those specific issues.
Any follow-up questions? Okay, if not, well, so if you do have questions, you can also put them in the Slido. I posted the link to the Slido here, so you can post anonymously. And the next question that I'd like to ask, which was upvoted once, was, can we have some quality control over reviewers? As we all must have experienced, reviews vary a lot on quality, and at times papers are unfairly judged. Mark, would you like to take that first?
Oh, that's a tricky one, because this kind of identifies the relationship between SIGCHI and the conferences that SIGCHI oversees. Now, this is not a simple relationship, but broadly, and this has been much truer in the past, the conferences seem to have a separate set of ways in which they manage their own organization. So there is some confusion about whether SIGCHI runs CHI. Well, SIGCHI does have some overarching responsibilities around CHI at a high level, but CHI also has its own organizational processes, as do the other conferences. So they determine how the conferences themselves run, and they determine how the reviewing processes are organized within their own kind of remit. The selection of reviewers is done by I think most conferences have associate chairs. So the associate chairs will be picking those reviewers, and the hope is, and that should be overseen by the papers chairs or the technical papers chairs, that process is being done in a responsible and suitable manner. That's not to say that SIGCHI also doesn't have some responsibility for this, but I think that sits around the sort of educational opportunities we provide for our volunteers. So we do have some training around how to become involved in SIGCHI, which involves things like how to do reviewing. And in fact, we've supported a number of activities to give people the skills to be able to do reviewing. But that's not at an individual conference. That would be an educational feature of being a member of this organization. Those activities we were hoping were going to happen in a bit of a richer way. I think there was a workshop at, funnily enough, CHI on how to do reviewing, but part of, and that was the last CHI in Hawaii, but I think that didn't happen, or at least it may have happened online. I'm not sure of exactly what happened there. It certainly didn't go ahead in the rich face-to-face format that we'd anticipated it happening in. So I hope maybe that kind of clarifies that relationship, but broadly, the selection of reviewers is done on a conference basis and not determined by SIGCHI. We can certainly, if we have issues around this, we can go back to the conferences to have that discussion. But it appears to be a regular complaint levels at conferences. Oh, this doesn't work. But I think this is on a paper by paper basis. Some people, unfortunately, will probably not get the reviews that they had wished for, and very occasionally, sometimes reviews or the review process is not conducted as effectively as we would like it to happen. Is that something SIGCHI should deal with? Not immediately. That should be dealt with on a conference basis in the first instance. And where those processes have deemed to fail, that would come back to SIGCHI. But that's my interpretation of it. But I don't think that has happened so far. Again, I don't know the history here. Maybe Loren can come back on that one.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, I think you hit on it. You hit on the real sort of important procedural issue or organizational issue, that when it comes to reviewing, that's primarily a conference matter. And SIGCHI as the organization plays a sort of supporting role and, ultimately an overseeing role. But essentially, this is an issue for the conference. And of course, the issue is, the sort of fundamental issue for us as a community is how do we have sufficient good reviewers? How do we train people, and how do we hold people accountable? And again, conferences are working on that, and SIGCHI has played a role for, I don't know, providing support as necessary. So that's the way to think about that. I know Cliff has had experience here too. I don't know if you want to throw in anything.
Yeah, it's from the EC level, it's really hard. Even from the conference level, many of us have also served as steering committee chairs for individual conferences and papers chairs for conferences and things like that. I know for CHI, for instance, it's a challenge. And part of the challenge is our number of paper submissions are growing logarithmically, and our number of reviewers are barely growing at all. And if they are growing, it's linearly, right? Which means that we're having to search wider and wider outside of the core HCI community to find reviewers for CHI papers. And when we get outside of the CHI community, for people who don't share the norms of high quality reviews that we have for CHI, then it becomes more and more of a problem. So it's really a numbers challenge that we have because we get more submissions. I think Phil Planck figured out that we get about 8% more submissions to Chi every year. But we're not getting 8% more reviewers, I can guarantee you that. So either we're burdening reviewers, which also leads to a shoddy job because the reviewers suddenly have twice the reviewing load and need to balance their time commitment over that, or we're having to go outside of the community. So it's a real challenge for the community. I guess I just recognize that in the question, that it's something we need to work on as a larger group, not just as the EC. The EC is going to do it through training and support, and we can offer support through that. I think implicit in the question is, can we have some sort of like HR mechanism by which we can somehow punish bad reviewers? And that's been an idea that's classic kind of in the Chi community. I think all of us have wanted that at one point or the other. There's a lot of reasons why we can't. And a lot of them speak to the internationalization of our community. There are, for instance, a lot of countries that we operate in where that kind of record keeping would be illegal, right? And against the norms and rules of that country. So we have avoided that to this point, trying to go for the more positive approach of training reviewers, but that system's breaking down a little bit too.
I have a follow-up question. So certainly I agree on the point of punishing bad reviews. I don't think that that's helpful in the short or long term. But the other side of this, Mark, I guess, is about volunteer development, right? So we don't have enough of the Chi community members maybe doing reviews, but we also have new people coming in. And one comment that I've heard frequently is that it's quite intimidating to go through the process of even reviewing the paper. And part of that is about writing the review, but the other part of that is also that there seems to be quite a laborious process around it from September when you get reviews assigned to December when the decisions are finally done. And I know that this is specific to Chi, and so it is about the conference itself. But just in terms of addressing, I guess, that critique around people who are new to the process or new to the community, how do we create an environment for them to be onboarded, I guess, if they're interested?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because people come in to do the reviewing process at a number of different levels, right from first year PhD student to senior professors who've come in from different disciplines, all of whom have different norms, expectations, and skills to bring to this. So they come in with different things, and I think to apply a general method of dealing with that is not necessarily ideal. Let's start off with bringing in new researchers, and Neha's had a really good experience with doing this herself, where we've looked through building within Chi a kind of a training wheels process where they have early stage papers, the works in progress, poster type papers, late breaking work, which is seen as perhaps less prestigious, with a different level of reviewing that's brought to this. Those are quite heavily mentored processes, and because the levels of acceptance are quite high, this, when it doesn't work, this is not usually terrifically damaging to the writers of the papers themselves. And of course, it's easy to work with those reviewers to help them refine their skills and to write more effective and more suitable materials. The idea of this is that those people are then transitioned into and recommended towards reviewing for full papers. So there's this kind of training pathway in place, so your career as a reviewer can be built with training inside of that. For more experienced people, perhaps coming from different disciplines, that is trickier. Or perhaps even people moving through the time that they move from their careers as PhD students or PhD researchers into early career researchers and then onto faculty. what we're trying to do is to build some means of offering recognition for people to do that. So if you do reviews, those reviews become visible. Then conferences, not simply one conference, but all of the SIGCHI stable of conferences are able to see the quality of the reviews and the comments that review managers will have given those people. So those good people who are knowledgeable about particular things can be selected for the right kinds or the most suitable kinds of papers that exist. Some of that facility is currently available, or they're not particularly within PCS, and we're trying to extend that capability within the new system that we're trying to design to do this. This is a somewhat longer term project because these are not simple tasks that we're trying to undertake, but we'll try to provide steps on the path to doing that, to bring on good researchers, make sure those researchers are recognized, and then pull them in where we can do that in a most suitable manner. It's trying to take this at a multi-layer stage, so from training, but also thinking about, so one direction is getting training to people so they can make more effective or write more effective reviews. And the other side of it is allowing people who have the skills to be brought on in the appropriate places.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer, Mark. At this point, I want to also check in with the room and see if anyone has any questions that they'd like to pose. Well, if you do, feel free to raise your hand or just say something in the chat. And we can move on to the next question. Okay, so there are a couple of questions about chapters, and I wanted to say that we are going to have the VP chapters also do an AMA when we come back in October. But is there anything that you'd like to say, Loren, Cliff, about chapters and our activity across regions and countries and how we've been approaching that?
Well, I see the question, and I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question specifically. And as you said, Neha, the Vice President for Chapters will be on a later AMA. And I guess I would just say my understanding of chapters is that each chapter is a local entity. It is focused on a particular geographic region, sometimes just a city, sometimes a larger geographic region. So they are local entities. And traditionally, the role of the Vice President for Chapters has been to support each of those local entities, and also to some extent to try to play a proactive role in saying maybe there's an emerging community in a particular area. Could I talk to people there and see if starting a local chapter is something that would be a good move forward for them? So I guess that's just a little background on chapters, the role of chapters and the role of the Vice President for Chapters. Not sure if that answers the question as it was posed, but I guess that's my take on it. I don't know, Cliff, do you have anything to add, or Mark?
Yeah, I would say a lot of our effort around chapters has really recently focused on kind of globalization efforts. Susan Dre is in the call, and I want to recognize her efforts in this area over the past few years too, building up communities in North Africa and Latin America. And then the role of the EC is we provide some funding for chapters so that they can do activities. Basically, we want chapters to be as independent as possible because they're kind of like the engines of creativity for us, right? They come up with good ideas and then we adopt those ideas later. I think there's a lot of work that could be done with chapters. I could imagine the next EC really making chapters a focus. In the US, for instance, where I'm at, I think there's been some drop in chapters around practitioners and students. Like I could see a lot of work in chapters that really helps to develop our stronger connections with the practitioner community and stuff like that. So we've had a particular focus for the past few years on global chapters, and that's a good and the right focus to have. But I think we could also think about an entirely different set of directions that chapters could go and work we could put into that. So there's a quite a bit of space here. I'm really excited about chapters, and I'd also like to recognize the work of Eunice Sari, our VP of chapters, and all the great work she's been doing supporting our chapters globally and really advocating for them.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with all of that. I think the difficulty of that question really is, what do they mean by holistically here? Is it's by kind of academic discipline or industry, or what could we be doing here that's being counterbalanced against the locality of chapters? And actually, the locality of chapters seems to be a real strength now, given that we're not meeting at conferences. This is many of these people the people in these chapters are able to have a place together where they can physically engage with one another, where that is allowable and possible. So this is a great thing to be putting forward at the moment, given that physically we can't be in the same places at conferences. It's extremely valuable.
I have kind of a basic question about chapters, actually. Maybe I should know this, but do we have any chapters in the US or like in North America in general? We do. Someone was asking me recently, saying that they hadn't heard of chapters around them, and I guess that there weren't any in the US.
We have had on the SIGCHI site a map of all the chapter locations around the world. I'm not sure if it's still there. I'd have to poke around, but yeah, I mean, I guess initially probably the first chapters all were in the US and then expanded beyond that, but sure.
So this might be another question that's relevant on the topic of volunteer development. Why is the ACM SIGCHI Ambassadors Project not active at this time?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. It didn't come under the original remit of my role, so I'm going to feign, or at least kind of admit ignorance on that answer. You can ask me anything. I can't necessarily answer everything.
I can give you a overly frank answer about it. Like, I always get in trouble on these AMAs because I don't have a good filter. So I think part of the reason is because it's just not been a priority for this EC, right? When you have an elected in executive committee, they come in with a set of goals and agendas. And often it's not that it conflicts with the previous EC's agenda, but everybody you volunteer for this role because you have a passion for a certain set of things that you want to get done. I mean, these are hard jobs to do. And you don't do them so that basically you can just follow the game plan of the last EC. So unless a role or group like that is embedded in the bylaws, it's very natural that I think one EC after another is going to kind of change their position and de-emphasize some programs and re-emphasize some others. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think you get innovation by doing that. And I fully expect the next EC is going to have a different set of values and goals than ours did, and drop some of our programs and keep some of them. Like, that's just the nature of this type of organization.
Thank you for the link, Susan. Okay, so there's some more questions around chapters and I guess and ask for data on these chapters. So maybe the question here might be, okay, and two questions actually just showed up. So let me quickly just ask this. So who would be best to answer the question of sharing data on chapter members? Is that information that SIGCHI provides, that ACM provides?
I know ACM has access to that material, but I don't know. Are they looking for particular people? In which case, obviously, we can't offer it, or is it simply overarching data on which are the most active sites?
I mean, unfortunately, the question's kind of vague, right? Like, we're not quite sure what data they want. Speaking in terms of general principles, we consider the confidentiality and privacy of our members to be paramount importance. We also find that it's really important to follow the different privacy laws of the countries that we operate in, especially laws like GDPR that operate in the European Union. So we have to be very, very careful about the kinds of data that we release. I think sometimes people read that as lack of transparency, which I totally get, right? Like, you know, in a perfect world, we could release all the data and everybody would have access to it, and we'd have a fully open data scheme. I know that some of our EC members, like Ayman Shama, our VP of Operations, and Julie Williamson, our VP of Publications, are working hard to figure out what kinds of data around certain things they can release or not. But it's a constant negotiation, and not just as simple as like, oh, sure, here's all the data, because we have to be so, like, our primary job has to be protecting the privacy and confidentiality of our members.
There's another question about conflict of interest policy, saying a person who's being considered for an award should remove himself or herself from the award committee. Why the specific policy hasn't been respected and addressed in the context of the recent 2020 ACM SIGCHI chapter website competition. So I don't know if anyone can take that question. I would say that's also probably a question for Eunice to answer and explain.
Yeah, I would say I certainly don't have any information about that at all.
I mean, yeah, I know the case that the person's talking about, but I would defer that to Eunice to address.
Any questions from the audience? I guess that's a good question to address here, maybe conflict of interest policies and how they are often not well understood. So any thoughts on that, or just how does one go about kind of wrapping one's head around that?
It's difficult keeping up with what conflict of interests are under all circumstances. And we as a SIGCHI tend to draw from CM, who provides the broad majority of the conflict of interest policies around reviewing and things like that. They are often framed in quite a general way, which then when you bring them down to the specific levels of application are ambiguous, to be honest. And I think this is the nature of the beast. It is difficult to specify exactly what things are conflicts of interest, where they may involve very different kinds of activities. But things like reviewing are quite well identified. Things like conference management and awards are generally quite clearly defined. Certainly we could do more training about this, as Susan states. One of the problems, of course, is that this information is relatively easy to find, and my guess is that the people who are most likely to make errors around conflict of interest are also the least likely to take up the training around these kinds of things. We can certainly try to engage more with the community around these and help people locate content and work with people who may be likely to deal with these, such as papers chairs, conference chairs, awards committees. We can certainly help them through and engage with them to make better decisions and to make appropriate decisions. But I think a broad set of training around conflict of interest is probably likely to attract very little community enthusiasm or take up, just presented by itself as part of a broader package of training how to be a good community member. That might be a useful component to add, and certainly it might be a requirement if we have particular roles where that's the case. It is tricky to enforce some of these things, but we could certainly have a conversation. We could work with conference chairs and papers chairs or people in positions of responsibility, just to have a conversation with someone who is able to provide that content. I do take your point there. There are logistical issues around doing some of these things too. Any of other EC members want to address that?
No. Okay, so moving on to the next question. There's a couple here, and we can come back to the room if anyone thinks of anything towards the end. With regards to volunteering again, Mark, what are the different ways in which an undergrad student can help out and participate in various SIGCHI activities?
Well, again, this is a two-part answer here. So there is helping out with SIGCHI activities, and there is helping out, at the level of SIGCHI, and then there are the things that SIGCHI is most known for, which are its conference and other activities, such as things within local chapters. Those are probably the best route into engagement with the community. How do you, I don't think there's any limitation on things like student volunteering. I'm not aware of requirement to be a PhD student to do that. There may be media roles, for example, where people could use their skills and education from their undergraduate programs in leading on those kinds of things. I think there is an issue, of course, around some of the roles needing particular levels of expertise. Things like reviewing a paper is probably not going to be something, I'll say probably because there are always exceptions to this, but it's probably not going to be suitable for most undergraduate students because they have not had that experience working in the specific fields that those papers are being written in. But there's no reason to preclude that if those undergraduates come in with existing expertise. I recognize that not every undergraduate student is 20 years old with no direct experience of particular research areas or experience in industry. Sometimes they will bring that expertise to the area, in which case they might be the very person you want to review that material. So it comes down to a level of experience, but broadly, there will be non-academic or non-expertise determined areas of work that they can engage in, and some things are naturally going to be more difficult to engage in. But local chapters are another area where people can engage, inviting speakers, organizing events, and so on. That would be a good way in, but I recognize not every area will have, or not every location will have a local chapter that students can engage within. Over to you guys.
I'll just expand on that a little bit. Thank you, Mark. I mean, I think you hit all the important points, but it's, you know, and you started out, I think, in the right place. What is SIGCHI? We're a conference, we're an organization that supports a bunch of activities. We support over 20 conferences that happen every year. We support summer schools, winter schools. We support various activities. And if you think of all of those as being events and activities that are happening under the organizational umbrella of SIGCHI, there are lots of opportunities for people to get involved in various roles, some of which, as you said, like reviewing, may require expertise, and some of which just require willingness to come out and be involved, like student volunteer or local arrangements or things like that. And I personally was not involved in SIGCHI as an undergraduate. I'm not sure if any of you were, like Neha or Mark or Cliff or Susan, but you know, I know there's people who've started out doing what you might think of as very simple roles, and they were excited about being involved in the community, and they gradually took on more and more responsibilities as their knowledge of the field and involvement in it deepened. And so I would say that's really the way to think about getting involved when you're new to the community, whether an undergraduate or just new to the field.
Yeah, totally. I would want to encourage people to get involved. I certainly would not want to put people off. I think there are things that anyone can bring to enliven the life of the SIGCHI member community. It's just finding out and thinking what's appropriate and the things that you are able to contribute to. What skills can you bring to this? What enthusiasm can you bring to it? And then thinking about how can I map that enthusiasm to the available set of activities, be that at a conference level or be that at the level of SIGCHI itself. And we do have involvement with things like social media campaigns. That does not necessarily require a PhD in social media. It might be just an ability to engage with audience. Those roles are not necessarily currently available, but they become available on an occasional basis.
There's a couple of questions that are related, Loren, so I'm going to combine them and pose them to you first. So with regards to what you said about recruiting criteria for the EC, what does it mean to be familiar with SIGCHI? What is the vision? Do you have an example? And also, there was another question posed earlier about plans to diversify the EC. And I want to kind of ask if you can answer the more general question of what an ideal EC looks like, according to you, given that you're probably thinking so much about it. Do you have thoughts on kind of levels of experience, you know, diversity along many different dimensions, really?
Sure, that's a lot of questions.
I know.
I did want to point out that there was a post, I guess, from that Helena made on the SIGCHI blog or on the Interactions blog earlier this year. It's called The Changing Faces of the SIGCHI Executive Committee, and I just posted a link to it. And this really this addresses the issue of diversification of the executive committee. And I won't go into detail, but it's worth a read. Addressing that issue again, I would say I've put together, or I should say, working with other people on the executive committee, I put together a pretty diverse nominating committee. And in our call for nominations, we've really emphasized that we want a diverse makeup for the executive committee. So, you know, that's how I would address that general issue. More specific issue about the kinds of experience we want. I guess I would say, you know, as we've been talking and answering various questions here, part of what we've been doing is saying, well, what does SIGCHI do? SIGCHI is this organization that supports a bunch of conferences, supports a bunch of summer schools, supports a bunch of local chapters around the world. We have funding opportunities. We oversee certain processes. We give support to conferences as needed. We are a liaison between conferences and chapters and ACM as necessary. And I think in order to be on the executive committee, you need to have some knowledge of that, some familiarity. If you'd never heard of, the executive committee and didn't have any idea of the role it played, I think this wouldn't be yet appropriate for you, as a position. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be or can't be involved in SIGCHI activities, and we just talked about that a few minutes ago. It also, I should say, if you don't have a good knowledge of SIGCHI activities in general, it may not be a good fit for you to be an elected member of the committee, but it might be that you would be a perfect associate chair if the executive committee has a particular need that they think, a particular role that they think needs to be filled. You might be a fit for that. Let's see, what else? Oh, I guess I want to sort of throw it back to you, Neha, and maybe Mark, because both of you are new to the executive committee. You've been on it for a year or so, maybe, and I guess I maybe like to, I think it'd be useful for both of you to say, well, what was your familiarity with SIGCHI? What was your experience that made you feel like, yeah, I understand this well enough that I could take this on?
Mark, would you like to go first?
I was going to offer you that. Okay, so my experience has been, I suppose it's a similar route to many of the people on the committee. I've done reviewing. I've acted as AC. I've acted as an SC at CHI. I've worked on a whole bunch of conferences, and I've taken on some kind of large roles within the conferences. And this was kind of the driver for my taking on the role that I have in volunteer development, which is one of the things that's been very frustrating as someone who works in those, is a point that Cliff made, is things like reviewing are growing far more slowly than the number of papers coming in. So this is somewhere that I feel I have something I can bring, some experience of working across these volunteer activities, understanding the problems of attracting and recruiting volunteers for this. And because I've been involved in that and seeing the problems, I've tried to come up with some solutions for that. This gives something of an abstraction away from an individual conference level to think about what are the bigger scale problems. How might we address them with larger solutions than a kind of ad hoc by conference solution? What can we bring to this that would make the whole set of conferences and the whole set of member activities more effective and better enabled at a volunteer level? So it's really coming from a real experience of issues, concerns, and some of the solutions, an experience of some of the solutions that could be applied here. I suppose that's my experience of how I've ended up taking on this role. So it's an experience. I'm sort of dropped in this role because there's an empty, well, I hope I haven't dropped in this because there's an empty space that needed to be filled. It was something that I could bring some expertise and experience to. And I felt a need for this. This is something I wanted to contribute to.
I can share my thoughts. So firstly, I want to acknowledge and recognize the extreme amounts of mentorship that Susan Dre has given me over the years. And that had a big role to play in how and why I even thought about joining the EC. And, I have to say that even though I had heard a lot about it, it still was completely new to me. But the reason that that I was drawn to this role was basically because I care deeply about global equity and inclusion issues. And that's, a big part of my research agenda. It's a big part of just who I am, I guess, or who I have been growing up, and a function of the countries I've lived in and all of that. So I have to say that the thing that was most exciting and most inviting to me was just the opportunity to do things in this space. And it was wonderful to be able to think of something that I wanted to do and find full support in doing that. And there was never at any point anyone that said that, no, this is not something that we care about, or this is not something that we do. I've always been able to have conversations about things that I care about. And that's the second thing I would say, is that it's been really valuable as an experience for me to come in contact with so many people who care about the community. Because everybody who's on the EC, as far as I can think, really does deeply care about things that have to do with the SIGCHI community. That's why they're there. That's why they're on the EC. And so being on the EC, it's really valuable to have that that type of support. And then the third thing I'll say is that it's been an endless learning experience. So even if you come in thinking you know what it's about, even if you like the people that you're working with, still it's this constant process. And sometimes you have things thrown at you and you don't know how to respond to those. And so, you know, there are others who can help out, but I wouldn't say that it's 100% like amazing and joyful experience, but I would say it is a high percentage joyful experience to be in a position where you can do many different things that you care about doing within the community.
Yeah, and I should say, I think none of us answered the question, what is a vision, or examples of a vision? But I would say, you know, Neha came into the committee through an open call process, and I believe you had to write a vision statement. And again, maybe you want to talk about it briefly, but I think it's just basically, what are your goals? What is it that you want to accomplish by being on the executive committee? So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Neha.
Yeah, it was a really fun exercise. It's basically all the things that you have problems with, you just turn them into like potential solutions, right? So things that you would like to address. So if you think that education is you know, is a problem, is an area that or like HCI curricula, for instance, that's a question that we didn't get to, but that's certainly something that I've heard from a lot of people, that you know, we don't have HCI curricula in the context of many countries. B, if we do create curricula, are we creating it from a Western, North American, US-centric perspective? So how do we think about decolonizing these perspectives? Like, those are all kind of a bunch of really interesting questions that, for instance, no one right now on the EC is really focusing on, right? So that could be something that someone could come in and say, well, this is what I'd like to really focus on, and then work with people across chapters, across countries, to see what that looks like. But it's really kind of listing out the things that you care about, thinking about what concrete steps would actually look like, I think, in the near future. And unfortunately, I would say a lot of that has to do with what experience one has or one has seen so far of the organization, right? Because it might be hard to make suggestions. Like, this is something that we've experienced recently, where we did a bunch of calls and had a bunch of conversations with folks where we talk about what they think of or how they view or perceive SIGCHI. And often it turns out to be the case that there isn't a very clear understanding of the kinds of things that one can do within SIGCHI and the things that are hard to do within SIGCHI. And so I think even to get to a point where one can put together a vision or come up with these pain points and propose solutions, one has to actually first have that transparency into the organization. I think that is just that is the hard part that I think we're all also working on the EC right now to try to promote more and more transparency around the issues that we face and the approaches that we're taking and so on. Okay, It is 11. Is there one final question that anyone is burning to ask? Because if not, then we will go ahead and end this call. Susan.
It's not really a question as much as a thank you to you guys, all of you, for doing the hard work that you're doing. It's not, I know it's not easy, and you're doing a really good job. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susan, for always being generous. Thank you all for joining us on the call. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Loren. You've both been extremely patient with answering a long list of questions. This is the longest list of questions we've had than for any other AMA. And thank you, Cliff, also for taking time out to join us. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.